The World Esports Association has been announced, and since it's a project which its genesis comes from ESL, the Electronic Sports League, people will actually think to themselves, it'll be interesting what I'll say in this video, since it's been publicized that I'm actually going to meet with some people from ESL on Sunday at the ESL Pro League Season 3 Finals, and the obvious implication there is to, in some way, discuss how our relationship will be in the future, if there will be one in fact, potentially, maybe we will one day work together. Are we all open to these sorts of things? So in light of that meeting essentially coming up, like less than 2 days from now, you could say, in theory, this is a topic that's risky for me to discuss, because if you've seen my past videos on the topic of ESL, I'm very critical of a lot of the things they do, and usually the way that they do it, and the way that they say things, and the way they phrase things. So you might think to yourself, the obvious move here is just to be cynical, is just to not do the video, maybe wait and see how the meeting goes, then do it on Monday, just do something like that, or maybe not do the video entirely if the meeting goes really well, and there's the implication that things are going to progress in some way that'd be beneficial to me personally. But you know what? I've thought about that, and that's not the way I'm going to go about things. Because these sorts of videos and the freedom to be able to put out critique like this and to be able to translate things into my perspective and explain to people how I see things and the questions I have in these certain matters, who I want to be as a person, and what I want to do in this industry, and what I've done in the past, and there's something I think I have a skill for. So whether or not that would mean potentially jeopardizing a future burgeoning relationship or working with an organizer is not something I'm ever going to let be a considering factor, something I have to use as a decider as to whether I do something like this video or not. And that doesn't matter who I work with in the future, whether it's huge people on the scale much larger than esports or small people who I'm associated with. No matter who it is, I will be open to critique them to any degree I choose to. So with that said, it's also the fact that a key reason as to why I think that's the way to behave is not just because I think it's the way to be the sort of person you want to be in the future, but if I think about it, logically, if ESL was to get upset at this video and to say, right, as a result, you know what, forget any relationship with that person, let's go back to the way things were before, where it was a war of attrition, and we're definitely not going to work with them in any possible context, then you know what, then they're not the sort of people I would want to work with, actually. They're not the sort of people I would want to be aligned with, and not the sort of people I would want to cooperate with if they're actually not willing to cooperate, make any sort of compromise, or allow people to have their own opinions that don't align with what ESL's are. With that said, in light of the fact that at least the concept of this meeting, the premise, is that we're going to talk and discuss things, I'm at least going into it in good faith. Like, I'm not going into it thinking that, oh, fuck these guys, I'm not going to listen to what they're going to say, or I'm just going to wreck them, or whatever. No, I'm going into it as though, let's see what happens when they actually are in some way not hostile towards me. Because in the past, ESL's never actually shown any sort of even implication they wanted to cooperate with me, or discuss anything with me, or in any way ever collaborate again to me directly. And so as a result, one thing I will say is, normally I would critique them, and all the critique would be entirely justifiable and would fit to my perspective. But you know what? For fun and entertainment, I'd add in a lot of spice to it, because I dislike ESL, at least in the past, the way they behaved towards me and the way they've seemed to align themselves against me in certain areas. So with that said, in the good faith, the good spirit of the meeting, I won't put the mustard, the peppers, the hot sauce on this one. I'll just present my thoughts, essentially. So, what is the World Esports Association, or WESA, if we're going to call it that in this particular video? So, it's an association of ESL, one of the biggest esports companies and one of the #1 tournament organizers, and I think it's 8 teams, mainly European in terms of the players, but a couple of them are from North America in terms of where the organizations are from, but mainly European. It's an association of these people together, and then from that you have to understand the hierarchy of how it works with the committee and the meetings, and players who somehow get a voice in it, and the teams at the bottom of the foundation. So some of the aims of what it will do is it will determine standards, which it will then sanction tournaments using those standards, and that's essentially the most basic explanation of it. It's not a league. It's going to sanction leagues. It's not a player union, but players in some way will get a say. In theory, it's not a team union, because it's not just like the teams are involved and then there's just like a president of the team union. There's also a body like above the teams that makes executive decisions, and then there's arbitration for teams that have conflicts. So it's not entirely a team union, and it's not an organizers union because there's only one organizer in it, but it presents itself as though in an ideal world it would be an organizer union that in some way worked with teams, that was partly a team union, and in some sense players had a say, but it's not a player union. So you can see from the very outset, even the concept and the premise is actually put poorly defined. It's not really, in as much as they have defined it, but in terms of how they're trying to present it and what they're trying to associate it with, I don't think they've done a very good job of getting the message across as to what it is. Now, yes, I will admit, part of the problem is when this got leaked, so they had no control over the information, people thought, right, this is an ESL exclusive league, and oh god, what does this mean? And they jumped to a lot of conclusions. But even when you pull back from that and you try to go into it again and first encounter the information, it's not that clear as to what it is. So again, we'll just go with the basic premise that it's an association in some way spawned by ESL, supposedly not run by ESL, that ESL allows a say for the teams that are members of this thing, and players have a say, and it will sanction tournaments, and then we'll go from that. So my problem with the basic premise of WESA is a lot of the things that they would cite as problems, I see as quite minor problems in light of what you'd have to give up right now for the solutions to those problems. So if there's problems like contract disputes, a player could just go to another team, and in theory, you can only pursue that contract through the courts, and then is the contract big enough that's worth the money and the lawyers and the time? All these things, first of all, some of them will take care of themselves when esports is big enough that we're talking about $100 million, then people definitely will take that guy to court, definitely will run it down, and we'll see who wins in the end, and people won't fuck around, because they'll realize I can only be an esportser for a year if people can hunt me down and actually hold me accountable to some of these contracts I'm breaking or things I'm fucking around with. So some of the problems would take care of themselves. My issue is that a lot of the solutions put forward to solving some of these problems lock things down into, if not directly exclusive, partially exclusive scenarios where there are only certain leagues you can be involved in, and someone does have a say over which teams can do what, and then the teams themselves are locked in as to what the players can do and how they interact with things. So that's one of the problems, is I see a lot of it as unnecessary. Like, I see a lot of these problems essentially coming out of having a lot of competition, having this huge free market and this open market, that as a result you get all these little small areas of difficulty. And yet, ultimately, the best teams are always still succeeding. Things are all still going well. These are fairly minor things, ultimately. Because, for example, nearly all the orgs that say they got a player stolen and poached from them and do that and the other, they do all the same stuff themselves. So what's funny is, in a weird way, people who tend to say, oh, I want all this locked down, tend to only be the ones where they were the ones who would benefit the most from it being locked down, actually. As in, they think to themselves, right, well, I'm the number one org right now, and at the moment, I wouldn't want any players myself, because I've got all the best players from this country in this game. Therefore, I don't want there to be any sort of open poaching. I want it to be where it's locked down, and I have a lot of say if the player goes there, and they have to negotiate with me. You can see how it nearly always, even when we're talking about making it better for everyone, that's nearly always making it better for everyone, primarily me, who it benefits the most, and then I'll present the notion that it benefits you. Also, teams battle with each other. Okay, they do that anyway. Supposedly, even this association comes out of the gate repeatedly saying that it's going to have arbitration or options and ways to solve conflicts. So even they're not all on the same page. And yet they're even implying like, oh, well, we'll have a way to sort these things out. Okay, how will that work then? Not a lot of information on it. Then you've got to consider that another problem is a lot of these issues, teams don't turn up to matches that they're supposed to. They drop out of a tournament after playing the online season. Leagues feel like they don't have enough control over the teams. Well, one of the main people making this concept, WESA, and the people who it spawned from, the genesis came from ESL. They themselves as a league probably don't like the fact that they don't have direct control over players and over teams, and that they don't have a way to enforce it. They can try in a soft manner to go to the team and go, well, we'll kick you out of the league, or you have to do it in a certain play, and then we want you to enforce it with the players. But they don't have a structure where they're directly in control of these aspects and able to have a top-down hierarchy. So this helps them in that particular sense. Yet it's all presented as some sort of altruistic thing on some particular sense. Now, what we're going to do here is there's so many topics to discuss and so many points made by different people that what I've done is I've just tried to read everything. And I tried to take all the interesting things out. And the first thing we're going to do is, as we go through, the main skeleton of the video is going to be addressing like the official public press release and breaking down what we think of some of that and translating some of it, and then taking in details from the AMAs and from tweets from certain people, and then trying to consider it all at once and ask lots of the questions. And then, yes, we're going to speculate some of the answers or say what we think, but we're not going to have all that many concrete answers, not least since they give so few themselves, so we're going to have to speculate. But the questions are going to be the important part. So it starts out and it says, after a year of intense negotiations, we are excited to announce the founding of the World Esports Association, WESA, WESA. In an effort to further professionalize esports, ESL has been working closely with some of the most renowned industry-leading esports teams to create an open and inclusive organization to oversee standardized tournament regulations, player representation, as well as revenue sharing for teams. So, okay, here's the first interesting thing. These negotiations have been going on for over a year, and they're an inclusive org. This association is let's see, it said it, to create an open and inclusive organization. So it's going to be open and inclusive, and yet they've spent a year discussing which teams can be involved and not talked to certain other teams. And not only that, but as an org, ESL's involved and there are no other tournament organizers involved. So immediately you really have to ask what it means by creating an open and inclusive organization. Right now they have not done that. They have literally done what you would call the dictionary definition of the opposite. They've created a closed and exclusive organization. Now they might claim, as they do here, that in the future it will be open, but even then, or it will be inclusive, but even then, later on, they go on to set the terms of there'll be certain requirements, etc. So it's not entirely open, for a start. I mean, at the end of the day, what the fuck does open as a word even mean if we're going to use it in this manner? Oh, the door is open. Well, I meant the door was open a little crack, so no one could really get in. Well, when you say the door's open, I think you can walk in or anyone can go in. Like what do these things really mean? Like, that's not really an open door at all, is it? It's a door that's locked, and then if you have a certain key, you can get in. So that's a locked door, isn't it, mate? Now, yeah, people who have the key can enter the door, so it might feel like it's open to them when they put the key in and walk through, but it's not really open, is it? And then you could put in a system where it's a computerized system where it scans you and sees you walk up the corridor, and then because it knows you've met the requirements, you get to walk in through the door and you get to be part of the meeting. But that doesn't mean the door was open at any point in time. It was definitely locked, and there was a locking mechanism there. So open and inclusive, well, at the moment it isn't, and they have shown no reason to suggest it is. So immediately that feels disingenuous the way that's presented right there. But let's say it's just the premise for now, even though they've actually gone astray in the first paragraph, essentially. So it also says they've been working closely with some of the teams, etc. Yet, there is no other league, aside from ESL, involved in this, nor has any other league said publicly that they were contacted to be involved in it. So let's think about that. These orgs have said they're not involved and were not invited. MLG, they ran the last major. Gfinity, numerous tournaments last year. CEVO, obviously smaller, North American online, but have LAN finals, had them at MLG and Gfinity. SLTV, StarLadder. All these people say they weren't invited and weren't asked to be part of it. How is it open and inclusive? Then, the other orgs, so DreamHack, part of MTG, same parent company as ESL, no word on it whatsoever, but they're not involved in it. Interesting itself. Faceit, who run ECS with all those millions, no statement as to whether they were asked or not, but they're not involved with it right now. PGL, no statement, not involved with it right now. E-League, no statement, not involved with it right now. So either everyone, collectively, you can put them all under an umbrella of this. They either weren't asked to be involved, or if they were, they haven't publicly said anything about it, and yet are not involved anyway. So right now, it may as well be the same thing. Because, for example, if DreamHack, Faceit, PGL, E-League all were asked to be involved, either they turned it down, which is interesting in itself, or they were asked to join, and they just chose not to, essentially. So if any of those people were asked, and it was a good deal, and they want to be involved, why aren't they in the organisation? Something interesting going on there, right? Then you got to go forwards and say, when they say that part about to oversee, let me see, where was it? To oversee standardized tournament regulations, player representation, as well as revenue sharing for teams. So, okay, here's what's interesting. They're going to oversee tournament regulations. So that's interesting in itself, because I always wonder what the fuck the big deal is where these orgs always want there to be a standardized set of tournaments across the industry. Like, why would ESL want Faceit, for example, to standardize tournament regulations between them? Notice they just present that as though that's something that obviously everyone would want, but they haven't made any case as to why there's a problem right now, as to why they have the solutions, as to why other people don't have the solutions, and therefore we need a standard that in some way someone's going to have to change to meet. They don't mention that. They never even, but the premise is just it's supposed to be accepted a priori. You're just supposed to accept it as soon as they say, oh, well, I guess that's just true then, that we need that to happen. I mean, do ESL's tournament standards need to be changed? If so, why was ESL not doing it? Why do they need this group to do it for them, which they themselves in some way have set up and are part of, but aren't part of, and people who are ESL employees right now are part of, but they're not operating under ESL when they're in this organization? You see how complicated it's already getting. So, in light of that, player representation is very important here. It puts then, as well as revenue sharing for the team. So player representation is important. So if players are going to be represented in some way in this thing, they're going to have some say in it. So here's my question. When they're overseeing that standardized regulation and players have a say, is this only about ESL events? Because at the moment, ESL events will presumably be WESA sanctioned, and other events apparently will as well, but they will be themselves. So are players going to have a say in how those tournaments are run, etc.? Because, for example, this year itself, ESL Barcelona, the Expo event, players complained there were bad PCs. Some teams complained about the hotel conditions compared to other places. I heard people talking about food problems in other scenarios. I mean, ESL themselves have some issues here. Is this body somehow going to help fix ESL and get ESL standards to a level that ESL themselves couldn't get to the standard they were at? If so, why? What would the players talking to them in this scenario do? Then we got to ask, what's actually the point if it's only ESL and not other events? As in, right now, if it's only ESL that's part of WESA, and ESL events will be WESA sanctioned, why would right now, what would the motivating factor be for any other event to accept WESA sanctioning, unless it's just some third-party thing that they do anyway? What would the point be for the other leagues to do that, if it means that ESL then gets a say over how your tournament regulation is done and all the rest of it? Not only that, but if it's not an exclusive association where these teams are part of it, and these teams won't boycott other tournaments, then why would you ever... Then what's the point of this? At the moment, the logic of this at the moment would only make sense if all you're doing is policing the way ESL's events are run and how player representations works within ESL and how revenue sharing works within teams that are part of this association somehow connected to ESL. How does this connect to other events? That has been quite poorly outlined, I think. If these teams are part of an association and they want this standardized rule set, and going forwards they want people to meet the standardized rule set and they want to have player representation and say in it and all the rest of it, does that mean these teams will group together and at any point in time boycott another tournament? Maybe right now, maybe another league right now. Does it mean that? Now, it's been denied in the AMA. They said people are going to be able to play in ECS and play in E-League, all the rest of it, which are already signed up for. But does that mean that in the future this group, part of the aim or part of the implicit plan is to one day be able to leverage that if they don't meet the demands of this group / association or the standards that this group produces in whatever way they produce it through their hierarchy? Now, the line, in an effort to further professionalize esports, that's a pretty tilt-worthy line, because how does this professionalize esports? What is unprofessional about esports at the moment that is needed? Presumably, these things are going to say it needs player representation and team rights. Now, let me ask you this. What is a comparable organization in another competitive discipline which was set up by a league organizer itself, such as ESL, who was in competition with other big league organizers comparable to them, yet which then went on to benefit the members, so the teams, so the franchises and the players, in a very big way, and maybe the larger scene outside of their league, without unduly skewing itself in favour of that org? Now, you notice that's their problem, is that when people ask them for analogies or people try to understand what this thing is and why it's not going to be used in an evil way, because that's what people's concern is, ESL keeps reaching for analogies and then using them really poorly. So they'll go like, oh, it'll be like the NHL. All right, so it'll be a league. No, I didn't mean it'd be a league. I mean, it start off with teams and get big. Okay, but then what about... if it's not a league, then what would it be like? Well, it'd be sort of like UEFA, so it'd be sort of like a football going. Well, not just entirely that. It also affect, because the thing is, if it's like UEFA, how does it affect things outside of UEFA? How does it affect football that's not UEFA? That's the big problem here. Is it trying to be UEFA? Is it trying to be FIFA? Later on, the guy who they brought in as the president overseer guy suggests it's going to be like FIFA. Well, FIFA's quite different from UEFA, isn't it? Because UEFA's European and FIFA's for the whole world. So you can see, even amongst how they themselves explain it. Now, these are all different people explaining, by the way. There's like James Lampkin, who's like a product manager or something at ESL, or vice president of it or something. Ralph Reichardt's like a founder of ESL. And there's the Pierre guy, who's the president guy of this. Now, they all reach for different analogies and they all explain it a different way, and they all in fact seem to not even agree with each other's analogies very well, except that they're like, oh, I guess in this one little sense it does. Now, it's true, an analogy is not supposed to mean that every aspect of it fits, but the point is, even the point that they pick out from the analogy to fit seems to then not actually fit that well with what another person's analogy is for the same point. They go to a different point. That's why I feel like even the ESL themselves can't even articulate this very well. And not all of it is just because they're trying to obfuscate whatever their plan is behind all of this. Which, by the way, they didn't do a very good job of explaining. Like, at the moment, they're just saying it's to professionalise esports. Okay, well, let's set up the premise again. Why would esports need to be professionalised? What is it that's unprofessional right now we need to stop? How would this fix those problems? Remember, it's not enough to just say, there's a problem, and here's my solution. Well, the merits of your solution, how would it work? Never you mind, there is a problem. Do you admit that? Yep. Then do my solution. But again, why would your solution work? Like, oh, my kid has a cold. Great. Well, drink this arsenic. Well, wouldn't that kill him? Well, let's just see. No, you wouldn't do it, would you? So you'd have to actually have a reason to go ahead with it. Because obviously, guess what? Certain solutions, certain treatments can make you worse, can kill the patient. So we need to have merits argued for these things, and studies done, and premises set up, not just taken for granted as we go. Anyway, let's continue. Chill out. So WESA will offer the chance to bring all esports stakeholders, I love that term, players, teams, organisers and broadcasters to the discussion table in order to bring much needed structure, predictable schedules and transparency to the scene. 8 of the world's biggest multi-gaming brands have contributed to the founding of WESA, with the association aiming to add more members and negotiations continue with various organisations. Now that in itself is quite interesting, because they have a line there where they say about organisers, so presumably like ESL, and then they say broadcasters, which right now ESL would probably count themselves as that because of ESL TV, but we think of the other broadcasters, so who are they? Like Face It, I guess, sort of. Who else? E-League? Are these counted as the broadcasters? Is Twitch the broadcaster? Is it TBS the broadcaster? However that works, the reason that's interesting is because later on they suggest that there wasn't space for other organisers in terms of leagues and they wouldn't fit anyway. So why does it say here that they offer a chance to bring these people together? What, those people just wouldn't be part of WESA, but they'd get to discuss things with WESA? How would there be a fair discussion there in that particular sense if one group's banded together and represented by a body who understands what they want and the others are just there? How would this interaction take place? Not really much described there, right? The founding teams are as follows: Fnatic, Na'Vi, Envious, Virtus.pro, G2 Esports, FaZe, Mouse Sports, Ninjas in Pyjamas. Now, what's interesting is that, as I said, they say they offer the chance for another org to come in, yet there is no org that's come in, and they've had over a year of discussing it, so presumably none of those orgs want in. They say they're offering transparency, and yet ESL themselves, to this day, have never admitted that they ever wanted any kind of exclusive league. They claim they never attempted it, that those stories, essentially, they're saying all those stories were lies, and that were only put out there, presumably by their enemies, some way to paint them in this terrible light, despite the fact, if you look at the way they've repeatedly behaved, that seems to align with what at least their motivations have been, and that when they keep making all these comments elsewhere, it's a shame there isn't standardization or something. Well, how would you standardize it? You need sort of like one group to all agree upon it, right? Yeah, one group, yeah. Group's the key word here. We need a group to agree on it. Well, there still needs to be someone to ultimately decide in a group and to adjudicate what happened in a group and some sort of head of the group. Yeah, there would, wouldn't there? With it? How would that work? It's interesting. Whenever you say all these things, it's all motivating you towards the idea that, yeah, at some point, we want to have a say in how these things are done. We don't think they're done right now. Therefore, we think we have an idea of how they should be done. We want to run them in that way. They never even admit that notion. I mean, the best they'll do is just like sort of go to the argument of like, well, everyone looks after their own self-interests. Like, brilliant, but how does that work when you're now telling me you're being altruistic? No. See, what I meant was everyone else looks after their own self-interest, but I'm actually a really altruistic guy, and I'm trying to actually just do the right thing here, and I'm definitely not trying to just look after my own self-interest here. I'm trying to look after everyone else's self-interest in a way. In fact, in a way, even when I look after my own self-interest, I'm trying to let you have a say with your self-interest and see if that can match up with my self-interest, and together we can standardize self-interests to increase professionalism of our self-interests in the industry. My industry. I mean the industry. So let's think of these teams. Na'Vi and Virtus.pro. Now listen, you know how I do these things. I'm just going to tell you straight up. Na'Vi and Virtus.pro are two of the most money-hungry organizations in the entire scene, especially Na'Vi. Now, the rumors even are, I'm not sure as myself, it's not something I looked into. Supposedly, Na'Vi and VP are even somehow connected or possibly owned by the same sort of people. Now, if that's true, is it fair that they get to have a spot each in an organisation like this? Haven't they just doubled up their share in that particular sense of the controlling group in that respect? But the point is, I'm not that surprised Na'Vi and VP are part of this group, because their reputation for being incredibly money hungry suggests that they would want to get involved with this if they thought it could benefit them and they could get money up front and all the rest of it. Now, in terms of G2, FaZe and Envy, all of these orgs in theory have a decent amount of money or have very good backing. Those are the ones that are a little bit more confusing. So presumably, there's going to be some sort of benefit for them beyond just joining and getting money initially. Presumably they think maybe in terms of the terms that they're going to get some extra sponsors out of it. That's the interesting one. Those are the three that really confuse me. I can't quite figure out their motivations for wanting to join that. Now, Mouse Sports, let's be real, Mouse Sports is just small. Yeah, in the end of 1.6 and in the heyday of 1.6, they were massive. They were a huge international organisation that had spanned way beyond just Germany. Now, Mouse Sports is a fucking German team. They're reasonably small. They're very small players. They haven't been a top org for a long time. So as a result, I could believe they'd want money and they'd want to be sat at the big boy table and all the rest of it. That one makes sense. NIP had much publicised financial problems, hadn't been paying their players for a long time, allegedly, and as a result caused a lot of strife with their team. I'm not surprised they would want money and that they would want to join anything that they think could benefit them in the very short term. The one that's really shocking, if you don't know anything about behind-the-scenes stuff, is Fnatic. Because you look at Fnatic and you go, right, of all the European organisations, these are the most successful one. This is the most successful one because these are the guys who've got the successful CSGO team and the League of Legends team and teams in other games. And they always get success and they're a very good org at putting together teams inside the game and running the org that way. Problem is that's all just in-game success and that doesn't always translate to out-of-the-game success. Now, things I've heard is that they've had some problems financially over the last year or two and that they're in a position where they need money and they need to be parts of things that are going to get them money very quickly. So as a result, that's not as shocking once you know that. Now, the really interesting thing about all these teams getting involved is the implication that one day, let's say just because WESA is very successful, this will be an exclusive organization, as in these orgs will only play in WESA events, or they will be exclusive together as a group and they will bargain together and they won't be elsewhere. Or maybe the organization will in one day own these teams in some sense. That would be quite interesting, right? We'll get into that later. So here's a question I ask when I see those 8 teams immediately. Who is missing? Now the answer, by the way, are tons and tons of people. Way more people are missing in terms of big names than are there. Now, yeah, in terms of European esports, not that many, right? So for example, Astralis. Now, it's quite interesting that Astralis isn't there because they are a player-owned organization. Now, what's funny about that is, if this is something that's going to benefit players and it's going to be good for them in the long run, it's going to get the money now, going to get the sponsors in the future, going to help them decide how tournaments are run, why is the player org, with very high-level players and a lot of fanfare surrounding them, why are they not involved in any way? Now, what's interesting is, as soon as this was even leaked, the manager of Astralis just first immediately came out and was like, I think it's time for a player union, which is very interesting because the implication there is we need a player union to act as a counterbalance possibly to this force. That wasn't just some out of the blue statement he made. Then you've got to consider this. So they were asked in the AMA, WESA, why Astralis wasn't involved. And get ready for this answer, because this is going to be very interesting. This shows that either the person answering doesn't know this following piece of information I'll give you, or they're being disingenuous, or they're outright lying. So he says, simple, they were not around when we started the process 15 to 18 months ago. The industry is in constant change, with team emerging and winding down every day. By the way, that immediately tells me the person's first language isn't English, but okay. The industry is, and it was not simply possible to involve them as they did not exist. We have a dialogue going with them and are hoping for a positive outcome. Oh, it actually says who it is at the end. It's the guy who's the CEO of NIP. So English obviously isn't his first language. Now, the reason this is interesting is FaZe did not have a CSGO team 15 or 18 months ago. They only got their CSGO team this year in 2016. Not only that, but years ago, FaZe wasn't involved in CS at all. Therefore, in theory, since this league starts with CSGO, you would never start talking to FaZe then. Yes, they were a multi-gaming team. As far as I know, I think it was like Call of Duty and possibly other games. I'm not sure at that point in time. But they had no involvement in CSGO. And at that time, in theory, unless poaching's going on, no signs that they were going to have a CSGO team beyond expressing their motivation to want one. Therefore, why would you have been discussing with them? You put the timeline 15 to 18 months ago when you started the process. Why would you start discussing with them 18 months ago? Long before even the rumours of them getting the Astralis team were involved. And that in itself is interesting. Yet they're involved. So that immediately seems to counter the reason given. So immediately the reason given doesn't hold up. And this is like step 1 of people asking questions. Then you got to ask, well, are there any big orgs? Well, yeah, go right to North America, right? So all of these orgs have teams in other games and are big orgs and have money and a lot of stature and even years now of being around and having some good people running them. Cloud9, huge org. CLG, long tenured org in League of Legends, has a good CSGO team as well. Team Liquid, obviously in both games, pretty relevant. TSM, not so relevant in CSGO anymore, but have a team in League of Legends, massive. They're big NA orgs. None of them are involved, have signed on. Yet if they really did start talking 15 or 18 months ago, and they've got FaZe involved, and they've got Envious, and they've got, who was the other one? Oh, those two involved, and then NA orgs, Does that mean they never talked to these orgs? Seems likely they did talk to them. That suggests to me those orgs didn't want to be a part of this. So that's interesting in itself, right? If it's going to do all these great things for teams and represent players and all the rest of it. How about Dignitas? Here's a European org led by someone, Odie, who's been and seen it all. He's seen CGS, he's seen the last few years, he's seen the recessions, he's seen the bubbles, he's seen it all. He's had successful teams in League of Legends, in CSGO, in StarCraft 2. He's had them in everything. And yet he doesn't want to be involved. He wasn't asked. I find it hard to believe he wasn't asked. Presumably he doesn't want to be involved. What's interesting is the only NA orgs that are involved are the NA orgs that have all European lineups. There are no North American players in this association, despite the fact some NA orgs are in. That's interesting in itself, right? It makes it seem like this is something that only European players want to be involved in. And the main people in Europe who don't want to be involved in it is the org run by players in Europe and owned by players. That in itself is quite interesting, even though we can only speculate from that maybe it's not as great for players as it might have initially seemed. Because, by the way, I'll just go ahead and say this right now. Teams like Na'Vi don't give a fuck what their players think about them joining an association like this. If they decide they're joining this association, then those players are joining this association. Those players, I would speculate, those players do not get to vote and say, sorry, owner of Na'Vi, we've decided we don't want to join that one. So actually, can you please not join it? No, it goes the other way around. He tells them, the boss man says, you know what, I'm the one who cuts your check, and we're joining this association now. So learn to love it, mother lover. What's interesting as well is they keep talking. I mean, it's called the World Esports Association. Yeah, essentially, it's the European Esports Association, and those are the players, and it's got a couple of NA orgs, but not a bunch of the other really big orgs, especially the big orgs that have invested in the CS before these newer ones. Not only that, you have to consider, where is Asia? No one from China or Korea is involved with this. Yet they have enormous orgs. They have orgs like Vici Gaming and LGD that have millions and millions of dollars to spend on players. There's no one from Korea. Where's SK Telecom, an enormous sponsor that has very good resources compared to some of these European Counter-Strike teams even. You know why those teams aren't involved and probably weren't even asked to be involved and wouldn't be anyway? Because they have their own associations. They have something called ACE in China. They have something called KESPA in Korea. I'll get to the KESPA one later. And what's interesting is, those organisations, in theory, do similar things to what this is claiming to, except players don't really have a whole lot of say in that. Players are treated kind of sort of a bit like slaves in a way on the lowest level. I'm sure they wouldn't like that characterisation, but call a spade, mate. Now, here's what's interesting. Why are so many teams, remember, only 8 teams are involved in this, so the majority of teams otherwise asked haven't joined. Some of them even of comparable or bigger size. Why are so many of these other teams not included if this is just an association which isn't about making money for joining and isn't about restricting things and running them a certain way or having them run ESL's way? If that's the case, if it's this cool association that everyone can join and have a voice in and decide rules and make the industry better and work together to avoid conflicts and have arbitration that'll be fair, why are so few teams wanting to be involved in this? And why are so many of the teams, ones that, as I've gone through there, have had financial problems in the past, have financial problems right now, have just shown a tendency to be incredibly short-sighted and incredibly money-hungry and just want the most amount of dollars today over what they could make tomorrow? Why is that the general trend? And then, yes, admittedly, you've got a few other orgs, mainly the newer ones from NA, etc., who are big and don't seem to have money problems. Okay, so there's a few that don't fit that, but the general trend does lean towards more the idea that it's like, if you pay the right money, I'll join this org, mate. So here's the next part. It says, one of the milestones of WESA is the creation of an operative player council, elected by the players, which will represent, strengthen and advocate on behalf of pro gamers on a number of important topics, such as league policies, rule sets, player transfers and more. The aim is to empower players when it comes to influencing decision-making in tournaments operated under WESA regulations. As such, the ESL Pro League for CSGO will become the first professional esports competition to adopt said WESA regulations. Well, golly, Batman, who could have ever predicted that? Now, the problem with this whole paragraph is, this is just like just an absolute bloodbath of buzzwords. I mean, it's going to, an operative player council, it's going to represent, strengthen, advocate. I mean, how are all these terms different? How is representing players different from strengthening players, from advocating on behalf of players? Are you just trying to fill words on your essay assignment here? How are each of those separate and critical details of it? Like, if it just represented and strengthened them but didn't advocate on behalf of them, how would it represent and strengthen them in that way? If it just advocated on them and it strengthened them, how would it not be representing them? Like, why is it written this particular way? Like, who is writing this? Then it's going to have them have a voice on stuff like league policies, rule sets, player transfers. Okay, player transfers for who? What, people between the teams only in WESA? Will they have some sort of bonding together and go, right, a player moved from a WESA team to a non-WESA team, WESA team, put your rings on, or the ESL logo, WESA logo in the sky, so we all meet at the secret coven, and then we all decide, right, they've taken a WESA player, so we're all going to agree to band together, right, and then we're going to deal with them and make them do what we say. Is that what's going to happen? How would they possibly do this? Will it only be amongst players in the WESA? No explanation whatsoever given, not even a hint given. Also, there's the factor that if they're going to do all these things and have a lot of say in those league things, what happens to players and teams who aren't in the WESA? They have no say? If they have a say, for example, let's say a player union joined, which would be something that would represent, strengthen, and advocate on behalf of pro gamers, say a full player union joined, and let's say it even included the WESA teams. Would the WESA teams, if they were part of a disagreement within the player union and they wanted a different thing, bond together and then essentially fight against the player union in terms of representing themselves towards the orgs? Would the orgs, such as ESL, still operate and listen to a player union to the same degree if there wasn't that same leverage that they could take all the teams out and all the players out and put tools down and boycott your event? There wouldn't be the same leverage, right? Now, here's where, with all these buzzwords, some specific examples would be amazing. Like, give us a... Obviously not a literal one, like when NIP does this to Fnatic, no, but give us a hypothetical and explain what you're going to add to the situation and what you're going to do, what currently is a problem and how you will fix it roughly. Explain the process and what would happen. That doesn't happen. If you really wanted to be transparent and you wanted to have clear communication, you would give examples, you would give specifics, and you would try and explain the mechanism of how it works. This looks like the people who wrote this press release are doing the opposite. This is instead obfuscating what the purpose is. It's about saying something, but never quite saying it in any specifics. So the person can never quite narrow down what it means, but you're constantly creating this feeling of professionalism by using professional words and middle management words, and you're trying to hit key words which sort of elicit a reaction from the public that you're gonna do something, but without ever saying what you'll actually do, without ever promising anything, and without ever outlining how you'd go about doing it, which suggests either you don't know, you don't plan to do some of these things you're just touching on, or you're in a situation where you don't want to be held accountable for that at some point in the future. Now, the obvious irony of ESL trying to do this approach through WESA, of trying to create all this feeling of professionalism, is that at the moment the public fucking hates this, mainly due to ESL's past shenanigans. Now, what's funny about this whole topic is really this ties in with the topic of why is ESL so bad at public relations and it's so bad at communicating with CSGO. In other games, they've had success. People like them in StarCraft 2 to a degree. In League of Legends, people kind of like them because they're not as bad as Riot and they run their own circuit and somehow they've managed to get Riot to get on board with that. Let them have some teams. People like them a lot more in other games. So why have they done such a bad job in this sense? Now, either ESL in the past, when these things were brought up, these implications, was doing some shady shit, or in the meantime, they have done a terrible job of convincing the public that they weren't. Why have they never been able to address those topics? Why have they never been able to explain why what they were doing wasn't shady? Why have they never, ever been able to present people who seem trustworthy and who seem like they are on the up and up, and even if they are working for their own self-interest, they're not doing it in a way to be malicious or to fuck people over, and they don't want to control the industry and all this thing. Why have they done such a bad job of convincing people of that? Why is it again and again that it only seems to build the case against them in this particular respect, at least as far as the public goes and as far as the public perceives them? Now, since they keep touching on all these issues of players, and you notice they make the whole player thing a really big key detail of it. Yet if you actually look at the hierarchy, there's a graphic. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use it in the video. I'm not sure what the rules are on these things, so I didn't. But you go on the WESA site, there's a graphic for sort of the hierarchy of how the site works, or the organised association works. And basically, it's a pyramid. I mean, if you want people not to think you're like a conspiracy, some Illuminati shit, I'd probably not go with a pyramid myself. Just my suggestion. But there's a pyramid, and at the top of it is like the executive committee, and they're doing something. And then there's like a meeting in which teams are represented, and the team members operate with the committee, and then the players somehow sort of get to talk to them, but aren't above or below them, sort of like on the side of them. And so the problem here is it's quite clearly not a player union. And yet they touch on so many player issues as though that was like the number one concern. Yet it can't be, by the very nature of the organization and the very nature of where power lies within it and what the hierarchy is for decision making and how things are sent top down in the org and how information comes up through the org, like it does in many companies, but decisions come from the top down and players aren't at the top and aren't on top of the pyramid and aren't the eye in the pyramid, as it were. Now, the issue there is, a lot of those issues sound like they're trying to address topics that a player union would address, yet it's essentially an ESL spawned association with people from ESL running part of it, and then the other people running and making the ultimate executive decisions that ultimately supersede everything are people who are team owners. Now, team owners and the league in which the players play, for obvious reasons, have a conflict of interest that suggests it's very unlikely they will operate most of the time on behalf of player rights and in the players' favour, especially whenever the conflict involves teams and organisers versus the players. They will almost never act in that particular respect, and presumably neither would this org, one would imagine. Now, they have not done a very good job of explaining and showing why that will not be an issue, that conflict of interest. If anything, it seems like in many situations, that conflict of interest would be a huge issue. A huge issue, I would suggest, that's bigger than player poaching, for example, for big orgs, etc. Now, they said there will be a player council, and the player council interacts with members' meetings and the executive committee. But remember, they're not on top of the pyramid. So ultimately, you can have a say in things and you can give your piece, but the judge decides at the end. There's not even a jury of players that decide in theory. So as a result, I don't really know how players are actually going to... Remember, it only says that the players will be represented, strengthened and advocated on. It doesn't actually say they get any actual say. They don't have any deciding factor in it. And even though it's an operative one, it operates, they don't necessarily get to decide anything. They can just give their opinion. So they've stressed a lot of the player thing, but the player thing seems quite a side topic, actually. Now, I mean, put it this way, if I had a cartel of a bunch of companies, and then above that I had a government of a country that was running the cartel, and then I said, well, we will let the workers all have their own little meeting, and then they can put forward one guy who comes to our meeting, and then he gives the opinion of the workers, and at the end we go, yeah, okay, well, I'll take that on board. Right, so what do we all decide? Okay, that's what we decide. Send that up to the head company, and then the government just goes, right, well, we've ultimately decided, our little group of 4 people, that we're not going to do that, actually. We're going to do it a different way. I mean, in this sort of scenario, it's unclear as to how that's not what's going to happen and how that helps the players in any particular sense. I mean, are we really to imagine that the big problem for players is just that ESL and these teams had no clue what these players wanted? No, it's just that these people, ESL and the teams, were in a position where they didn't have to do what the players say. They don't have to take on board what the players give a fuck about. And they can just ignore it entirely and continue doing whatever they want, which is what they've done up until now, at least to the extent that they can, and they get away with it. Now, there's then 2 quotes, one by Taz, one by Get Right. Now listen, these are 2 legendary players. These are players where if they retired today, and in a year we could put them into a Hall of Fame, I'd have both of these guys going in on the first 2 or 3 ballots. Some of the greatest players in the history of games, the most accomplished. Some people who actually do a very good job of being professional and speaking on camera, all the rest of it. With that said, I've known these guys for at least half a decade, some of them longer. And I can tell you from knowing them and from having talked to them that I'm willing to speculate neither of them said these 2 quotes. I think even if you took what they said, cleaned it up, and tried to polish it and put in better words using a thesaurus and try to update what they might mean from their language to this language, they wouldn't even think of some of these concepts. Not all of them, some of these concepts, and they certainly wouldn't express themselves in this particular way. And that's the meaning and the implication of some of the things they've said goes far beyond the way they would conceive of any sort of player component of this organization. And I think that these quotes really seem a little bit disingenuous to me. I would have gone with just a raw quote from them and kept asking players until I found someone who said something that seemed vaguely reasonable, that was in line with what went for the org, and just gone with that and seemed honest. Because like I say, even cleaned up, I just don't see any way that these players could have said these comments. So it doesn't instill a whole lot of faith in the org, does it? So here's another quote. WESA teams will not only participate in WESA sanctioned tournaments, leagues and offline events based on the... I misread that. WESA sanctioned tournaments, leagues and offline events based on the standards developed by the association, but also in other leagues whose schedules have been balanced prior to today's announcement. Now, what's interesting here is you could certainly say one of the reasons to explain it like this is to stop the initial panic when the league happened, that this is an exclusive league and that if you see a team here, NIP, that means NIP doesn't compete anywhere else. So I can understand putting that fire out immediately. But I also think the way this is phrased is to open the door to the notion that one day there could be a WESA only circuit. It's just not right now. And that one day maybe these teams will in that particular sense. Because remember, they're sanctioning tournaments. Now, they're sanctioning their own tournaments, ESL, or the people who aren't involved with ESL, but who are ESL employees and who are now involved with this, but as a whole thing, it's sanctioned the ESL in tournaments. How convenient. Will also one day sanction other tournaments. Now, they don't explain how. Will they have to join the association? Will they have to work with the association and agree to something? Is it just that you have to accept the rule sets? We don't know how you get sanctioned, but they imply that they will sanction other tournaments. Now, will they sanction other tournaments without talking to those tournaments? We don't know how that particularly works. So, who actually... does that mean other tournaments have to do things in the manner that ESL does? Or is it just that ESL does it the WESA sanctioning, and that will actually be different from ESL, and therefore someone else just has to match the ESL sanctioning? Would seem like the latter, but at the moment I struggle to see a difference between the two. Now here's the question. What is the point in having a WESA sanctioned event if, as they later stated, you don't have to be a WESA sanctioned member team to play in one? So what is the point in it being a WESA sanctioned event if you don't have to be one to compete, right? Presumably, it's to put the sanctions in place. It's to put the specific policies in place at that event, and they still allow others to compete. But essentially, they allow others to compete who then just don't get a say in it, right? Is that the way this works? Because the say for the policies comes from being involved in it, right? So as a result, what is the point in being WESA? Is it just to have a say in these things? You still haven't really explained to me why you need to be in WESA at the moment. Other leagues have balanced their schedules already. Now, what's interesting about that is the notion that other leagues have had to balance their schedules. Does that mean other leagues were already running that way and they said, right, we'll give a bit of space here? Or did they say, this is how our schedule's going to run? And other leagues had to go, right, well, we'll put ours around it like this. You know, we're not quite sure what balance means in that sense. Also, the fact that they have to mention that makes me ask the question, one day, will these teams band together and boycott other tournaments in the circuit? Not all of them, but some, on the basis that they either aren't sanctioned or that their schedule doesn't fit with this event. Therefore, this event will get precedence. If these teams are the biggest teams and these are the teams you have to have there, these teams will play in this one. Therefore, every other league will have these teams and the others and have to balance a different way. How will that work? There's then a part where they say about the guy who is going to be the interim league commissioner. So overseeing the work of the player council and the WESA representatives will be the first interim league commissioner of WESA, Pietro, apparently his name is Pietro, so apologies for that, Pietro Fringuelli, who brings a wealth of experience and expertise from his time as an advisor to some of the biggest traditional sports organizations across Europe. So, first and foremost, no mention of esports knowledge. They don't even attempt to cite any, so presumably he has none. Now, other sports, let's point out, are in some senses monopolies. One league runs the whole country. One league runs a whole area. There is no secondary league, or if there is, they're the next division down or something. This particular sense, those are monopolies, those are top-down hierarchical systems which don't allow open and inclusive free market, all the rest of it. Those are run in one particular exclusive manner. So it's kind of concerning to me if you use that as your model and that you even suggest that that's the place everyone should want to be. Because the problem is, why is this current thing never say anything about CSGO in the press release? Because they don't want it to be about CSGO. It's starting with CSGO teams, but they want it to be about all of esports. Now, how can you run all esports games at the same time through the same association? Like, how would players from different teams be represented? Is there only a CSGO player represented? Do you get a CSGO and a League of Legends player and a StarCraft 2 player represented? Do players from League of Legends get the same say as the StarCraft 2 ones? Do the guys from League of Legends get to have a say over how the ESL, over how the CSGO tournaments are run? These are all interesting questions. Nothing addressed there. It's about esports as a whole again. Even though, as we've seen, you can't really treat esports as a massive collective thing, especially when deciding very specific things such as policies for specific games of tournaments, etc. Likewise, for the whole world, it's going to be hard enough just in CSGO to get every top team in the world to be part of the association and part of the league. How the fuck are you going to get every team and every big broadcaster and all the rest of them, an organizer, on board for every esport in the entire world? Seems like an overly ambitious project right now that you have given no reason to suggest will succeed of those goals and those aims. Now, there's a statement by this guy where he says, We've tried to bring the good things from the old world of sports into this new industry, Fringuelli says. Such as, could I have even an example? What are we lacking that the old world of sports has that this new industry doesn't have? Can you give me any specifics as to what those would be? Could you explain why not having it right now, we will benefit from having it? What would any of that be? No, never anything given there. All vague again, essentially meaningless when you just say vague things like that. What I'm gonna do, folks, if I'm elected, I promise to learn from the mistakes of yesterday and build a brighter new tomorrow. I haven't told you anything right there. Who would say different? What politician would say different to that? Utterly meaningless statement at the moment. So, okay, the problem as well is when people talk in vagaries like this and they refuse to ever nail themselves down, even in terms of what their actual goals are. Even fucking politicians have to list some actual policies they say they will put in office. By the way, a lot of them don't do it. Obama didn't do a bunch of things he said. But at least even they are required by the public to at least present some policies, partly because there are other people who are the competition who will state policies and say, well, what is your policy on this? You've never said it. No one's forcing them to. Therefore, these people are refusing to list any policies. They're obfuscating their purpose. And when asked about it time and time again, such as in the IMA, they just hide behind the idea that, like, yeah, I'm trying to be transparent. Well, give me some specifics. Well, I can't. That's all NDA'd, and that would be that's a private matter. Well, then in what way are you being transparent? Oh, I put a window up so you can see through. I can't see anything in there. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I had to put tints on the window and then put posters over it, and I can't actually tell you, like, who's inside there, obviously. Well, then what's the point of the window then? Oh, to let you think that you can see in. Oh, okay, thanks. Now, on their website, because not everything was in that particular post, on their website it says vision. WESA's vision is to create an authentic framework to support and amplify sustainable growth of esports, based on the shared values of fairness, transparency, and integrity, and sharing that growth between the players, teams, and leagues. I'll just read the next part. WESA's mission is to become the global benchmark for industry-wide standards through that framework, involved parties and activities of the association. It will be the first organisation in the history of esports that will bring those affected by its decision most to the decision-making table. Even though, again, in theory, players are affected the most. I mean, can't you argue that in a way? Are they actually at the decision-making table? As far as I can tell, your own hierarchy outlines that they do not get decisions in that particular sense. I mean, technically, remember, the players aren't members of this. Teams are members of this. So the players have a say, and players are part of teams, but players don't get a say in what their own team does. Therefore, the team gets a say. So the team and ESL and then the committee, ESL is obviously part of the committee, have the decision-making powers, and yet the people affected most are supposed to be at the decision-making. Yeah, they're at the table, they don't get to make any decisions. Let's make that quite clear. Transparency towards teams and players, as well as continuous support to them, are the heart of the association. Yet that's the thing. That isn't the heart of the association. That's not even the set goal. The goal is to be an organisation and to standardise rules and professionalise esports, right? That's the first and foremost thing, and therefore to sanction events and all the rest of it. The heart of the organisation is not the players in this particular sense, or even the teams to a lower level, because they're forced to act in a particular way by whatever the executive decisions are. That's not the heart of the association. That seems very disingenuous as a statement, to put it that way. That does not seem like that's true, based on what you said. And you haven't given any reason in which that... haven't explained the mechanism of how that would work. In fact, all your mechanisms so far suggest that wouldn't work that way. And you haven't even suggested the actual spirit is built around that. In terms of, if we were looking in reverse engineering why someone would create an organisation, we'd never come to, well, they'd probably do it to try and make it so that, like, players got continuous support and had decision-making involved in it. Because then you'd never build the organisation out this particular way, as far as I can tell. That whole first paragraph was a disgrace of buzzwords as well. That they're going to create an authentic framework, right? As opposed to what? To frameworks that aren't authentic? Okay, brilliant. To support and amplify sustainable growth of esports. How will this organisation support growth of esports? Remember, this is going to support growth of WESA teams. How is it going to support the growth of esports? So outside of WESA, how is that going to help support that? How is it going to amplify sustainable growth outside of esports for people who aren't involved in this? Oh, it's not just going to do its own one, right? We'll just say, I mean, obviously you wouldn't, but just say to support and amplify sustainable growth of ourselves based on the shared values of fairness, transparency, and integrity. So if everyone shares these values, why could none of these teams accomplish any of this stuff on their own? Why could ESL not accomplish any of this on their own? And why aren't there already player unions, team unions, org unions that are already accomplishing all this? Since it's going to be shared growth and everyone's going to benefit and it's going to be sustainable, but it hasn't happened. Now, going forwards, there's a part where it says structure. The WESA Executive Board manages the day-to-day affairs of WESA and represents the organisation towards third parties. It consists of 5 members. 2 are appointed by the members. See, the problem there is you've just used the word members twice to mean different groups of people. Just a little hint about English. They mean members, bracket, WESA teams, as opposed to members of the board. 2 are appointed by ESL, so they get to appoint 2 of their own. No reason given as to why they get to appoint 2. No reason given, especially because later on in the AMA and in all subsequent tweets by people from ESL, they're constantly trying to deny that ESL is wanting to control it, that it's saying that's independent from ESL, that even though these people work for ESL, they're going to be acting in a different way, and they're even going to be sanctioning with ESL, and they're going to be working in that particular way, so it's not like ESL tells them what to do, it's the other way around, and yet ESL gets to appoint 2 people. Why does ESL appoint anyone? Why doesn't ESL appoint 1 person? Why 2? Never any reason given. And the chairman of the board is chosen by all 4. That's interesting in itself. So the chairman of the board is chosen by all 4, but 2 people are from ESL. So in theory, couldn't you have an infinite stalemate where 2 people from ESL didn't want this board person, 2 people from the teams didn't want the same board person, therefore you could never choose? Just wondering. Also in that scenario, since 2 come from ESL, logically, doesn't ESL, if they want to get the specific boardman they want, doesn't ESL just have to have their 2 people convince one of the other 2 teams, maybe with some sort of deal, arrangement, special interest granted, to be on their side? Then they have 3 out of 4, they get to vote and they get their person on the board. Interesting, right? Meanwhile, other way around, let's say the 2 teams want a specific person. Well, there's no way they can break up the 2 ESL people, in theory, and get them to do it if ESL, as an org, for whatever reason, not officially, acts in their own interests, right? That's problematic, isn't it? Currently sitting on the WESA Executive Board are Ralph Reichart, Managing Director, ESL. Now, this is me talking now, who was a founder of SK Gaming. He founded Turtle Entertainment, which became ESL, or runs ESL, or owns ESL, whatever the fuck the original concept was. And as a result, also used to run CPL Europe before ESL events. Then they've got Sebastian Weischer, if that's how you say his name, Vice President, ESL. By the way, it's already bad enough. Like, the Managing Director of ESL is involved. So the head person of ESL, literally who runs the whole company in some sense, he's involved in this particular sense. He's not going to act on behalf of ESL, and when things are at a conflict of interest to ESL, he's going to act against the interest of the real company that pays his wages. Okay, mate. Find someone who believes that, I guess. The Sebastian Weischer guy, I don't know, I've never heard of him. Hicham Shaheen, team owner, Ninjas in Pajamas. So he's the new owner, obviously, or he's owner of someone involved with Dig Life, which is the company that bought NIP. Not sure too much about him, haven't heard too much about him in any particular sense, but presumably he's supposed to represent NIP as a team, even though he's also just one of these people. How were these board members picked? Now, it says 2 were appointed by the members, as in the members supposedly got together and picked these 2 people, the owner of NIP and the CEO of Fnatic, to be who represented them. So interesting, and presumably in the future they'll do that again once the term of office runs out. I forgot to read that. Regular office term of each member of the executive board is 3 years. 3 years is a fucking long time, especially in the CSGO. Everything could be different in 3 years. So the last person is, I can't even read that. It's a Dutch name. It's actually unreal. I can't read that one. CEO of Fnatic. Now, it even says that he only joined Fnatic last year, and that before that he was involved with Skrill, which I think is some sort of like money transfer company. Not my favourite dish. So the problem there is, as far as I can tell, the people on this list, that guy has no understanding of esports, or very limited. He has been in it for less than a year. Now, here's what's interesting. What happens, since ESL has 2 board members, and there's 2 board members elsewhere that are from the teams, what happened if one day ESL buys one of the 2 teams that has a board member? Do they then suddenly just have 3 board slots, but unofficially, since technically they're not ESL slots, they're just people that ESL put forwards and that don't represent ESL, but are sort of ESL and are sort of also on this board? Can ESL just get a majority holding that way and then run the entire thing and essentially have a little dictatorship? Is that possible? Also, the regular term of 3 years seems too long, if you ask me. I mean, if you really want to show that you're very transparent and fair, I think you'd have like 1 year. Then after 1 year, if someone's fucked up and they haven't acted in the interest of everyone or whatever, then the teams can vote for a new guy and you can get that guy out and get other people in. Now, I realise the logic of, well, you need a few years to put things in place and the plans, etc. Yeah, we haven't been able to know yet that any of these people can do this job. They have shown no aptitude for it thus far. Interestingly, Sam Matthews, founder of Fnatic, had a comment on Reddit where he said, WESA has clauses for renewal of the agency agreement with ESL, meaning ESL is running tournaments for WESA, meaning ESL running tournaments for WESA has to be won via merit and is not set in stone. I believe this is 2 to 3 year rolling periods. So again, even though you're saying like ESL could be dislodged and someone else could come in, 2 to 3 years down the line, mate, which is the whole game. Remember, CSGO as a game has only existed for like 3.5 years, a little bit over that. So that's like the entire history of CSGO there. Think about how much shit changed. He then goes on to say, ESL does not dictate standards, except that they have the board, people who are of the executive committee of the board. And yeah, I mean, that alone's pretty good, isn't it? This is done by the board. But again, who ESL put 2 of the people towards 50%. I mean, at the moment, there's going to be a 5th one in theory, right? Which is the interim commissioner guy, I think. In fact, they are in the minority. They're in the minority, right? In as much as the commissioner guy's there as the decider, yet didn't they in some way appoint or find him? That wasn't very clearly explained. In fact, they are in the minority. So effectively, teams and players can vote to push through standards with the support of the commissioner. Now, here's the key thing to say there. I think he's very disingenuous by saying players there. Because as far as I understand WSA, and if I'm wrong, I hope people will come out and explain this to me. When he says, so effective, like they're in the minority, that's because ESL has 2 people on the 5 people board, right? And two of the people on the board are, remember, with the support of the commissioner. So what he's saying is the majority on the board that exceeds the minority of ESL is the 2 representatives of the team, the Fnatic and the NIP guy, and then the commissioner. That's the majority. Well, that's a majority representing the 2 teams and the commissioner. Where are the players able to push things through and to decide things? The players can't. Again, as far as I can tell in this system, the players can just tell their team owner things and they can tell people things at the meeting, but the decisions are made by this executive board and the players are not on that board. Therefore, the players cannot vote to push through standards with the support of the commissioner, as far as I can tell. Now, here's a question for you. Why is ESL needed at all? Why would these teams, if this is a great concept, not come together, the exact 8 teams, of their own steam and make their own org and vote for their own board? So instead of 2 from ESL, it's 4 from these people, and then they get the same commissioner. Why wouldn't they do all these things? Have they been paid by ESL to join this league? Is ESL running it, even though they say they're not? And therefore, they then use some of their capital to get these people involved. And then they say that they put other people in position, let other people delegate some power to those people. But ultimately, ESL sets the whole thing up. Because Sir Scoots asks in the AMA, he says, how much were the founding teams paid to join? Now, despite wanting transparency and despite wanting to address things, and even though some things are NDA'd, they didn't even answer. They didn't even answer to give a vague line of bullshit that had no actual information. They just didn't address his question, despite the fact he asked many hours ago when the AMA was active, and he is a veteran of the community and was involved in big orgs that themselves have done some interesting and possibly shady things over the years, knows a lot about the industry, and people wanted to see his answer. It has 931 points. Never answered. Now, is part of being involved in this, and is this part of the reason why ESL has to be the one doing it, that ESL are going to seek the sponsors that will then in some way, because they're representing player rights in some respect, going to go down to the different teams, and therefore teams will get some sort of sponsorship help from these people or some money from these people, or remember, revenue sharing with the teams. So will they get, the ESL get sponsors and then revenue goes to the teams. Therefore, ESL's present themselves as sort of the agents to be able to do that at the top level of this little association. Because if so, here's another question. If ESL's so good at getting sponsors and doing revenue sharing, then why don't ESL have the most money of all the big good tournament organisers? Why are people like E-League and Face It got bigger CSGO leagues? Maybe because they need a body like this to control other factors of the scene, to make themselves the biggest ones, to be able to get those sponsorships and the money that otherwise went to E-League and Face It. Maybe if they controlled the scene in this, even in this minor way, that's how they get the millions to go into their tournament and into the tournaments that WESA sanctioned and into the players' pockets and theirs, instead of that money going into Face It and E-League. Just asking. Maybe that's why. If this is going to be a huge thing that has real money, sponsors, then why can't the people who are on this commission, like Ralph Reichart, the other guy, why can't they just leave ESL and run this and have that be their full-time job and run this and be paid just a salary by the org Why can't they be independent in that particular sense? And then, yeah, they know people at ESL, so they'll be generous to ESL and listen to them, as they will with any of the orgs that they're going to sanction. But why can't they be independent? There's no explanation given for that, actually. In fact, that would suggest to me that those people need ESL and the organizations that they're a part of still. Because likewise, why can't these people leave those teams and have the teams be part of the league, but then they not represent the teams and they be part of the executive committee that know best for what goes on in the teams, but aren't going to be directly connected with it, and therefore people open to suggestions of conspiracy or bias? Why can't they be independent? The two people who are the Fnatic and the CEO head people. Why can't those people all be independent? Why can't we have the Pietro guy as the commissioner and then a bunch of other people from esports either not involved with those teams, so they're independent, or from outside of sports and come in and be independent? Why can't we have that? It's interesting because it would suggest to me that the people who are in those positions of making the executive decisions, ESL and these teams, want to have some say over it and want to control some things in a certain particular way. But why would they, when the whole aim is to be independent and to act in a fair and, you know, and in the spirit of integrity, and to just put forward player and team rights and also make sure that everyone works together and that everyone's fair, and then it's not just, you know, like organizers and teams dictating things to the players, even though the ones that ultimately will dictate to the players what happen and decide is organizers and teams, and the organizer seems to have a little bit more power and stake than the teams in a particular sense and has more leeway to potentially get more power. You know what, you can see the problems I'm getting to in this particular sense. So since those people need ESL and their orgs and can't leave them, how can they act independently? What happens when the needs and opinions and stances of the players and teams are separate from their team or ESL as an org? How can they act in the interest of both parties? Will they recuse themselves from it? If they do, how the fuck can they be on a commission where they actually have some voting say in it, whatever? There's a famous saying, okay, about democracy. It sounds cynical, but think about it. It says democracy is, I think it was something like, is like three wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. So you can understand the joke, right? The joke obviously is, even if the sheep goes, well, I vote not sheep, they all go, well, we all vote sheep, so get in that motherfucking pot, yum yum, lamb chops for dinner. And yeah, he got a vote, but his vote meant nothing, and the sheep were all, and the wolves were always going to win, and that was the whole point of them calling it a democracy. Really, the wolves were always going to eat the sheep, weren't they? But they made it seem like the sheep had some say in whether or not he was going to be eaten. He did, just no sort of deciding say, and they've actually used the system to control him. You're all sheep, you're all sheeple. So in this scenario, yeah, the sheep gets to have a representation. He gets to say, I want to put my input and discussion on the matter of what's you know, I want to discuss the in standardized policies for what a transparent standardized dinner menu would look like, so that everyone's needs are represented and we overcome a lot of the problems that existed before, such as what, and then the wolves going like, yeah, such as when that guy used to eat my sheep. I wanted part of that sheep. We should both get part of the sheep. We should go, well, no, not that. Don't always have to eat sheep, do we, guys? Well, no, but I like sheep and I'm going to eat sheep. And in the past, sheep has been what I'm entirely about. And I'm not going to stop being a wolf. I'm still definitely a wolf. But for this matter, I'm just separate of wolves and sheep. So now let's just vote what's for dinner, shall we? Wolf, maybe. Who knows? Let's all just be fair. I vote sheep. Sheep. Wolf? No, you've been overruled. Sorry. I mean, in this particular scenario, you can see the problem, right? So, good old Sam Matthews back again. Remember, even though I just said his org, I've heard, it's speculated, kind of run into the ground financially over the last few years. But he'll probably know best for everyone, right? So he says about things that this can help. Player transfer rules, transfer windows. Who will uphold illegal poaching? By the way, he actually illegally poached a player from SK Gaming a few years back, where he literally took the player while claiming that the player was under contract and therefore was owed his salary, and yet then claiming I can also take him because he hasn't signed the contract, therefore he's not under contract. So he actually himself did stuff like that, and yet he's now the one crying about why aren't they upholding illegal poaching? Contract breaking, again, bad behaviour, racism, you name it, right? Wait. What team can't at the moment control bad behaviour and racism? He was a founder of Fnatic, so his own team, Fnatic, he's implying, need this organisation to help them control bad behaviour and racism. Presumably of players, by the way. I assume he doesn't mean of teams and fucking organisers. So he himself can't control his own players. How is he going to help this, or how is this organisation going to help control his players? That's like a parent saying, yeah, and you know what? We really need to make it so that kids today act in a polite manner. Well, you're their parent. What, you didn't teach them about applying money? You can't convince them. How am I supposed to do that? What, put them in prison cells? What is the end solution here? Aren't you just admitting your own incompetence? So here's another one. Off-seasons, periods of rest. Unfortunately, for a sporting industry to be healthy, there has to be times for the changing of the guard, for player swaps, holidays, ha. Again, why can't you manage any of that? Presumably, if the teams all come together, I mean, the best way to get that, by the way, off-seasons, period of rest, is a player union. It's not actually a sort of WESA thing. Drug testing, bad behaviour enforcement. This will become a real issue as time goes forwards. So he's actually in favour of more drug testing. Let's just put that forwards. A founder of Fnatic is in favour of more drug testing. You know that thing where we were all like, phew, glad that's behind us. They didn't catch anyone. It's got a lot of downsides to it. And the moment in esports, it's not really necessary. No, he wants this. He wants more drug testing. He wants more invasion of people's privacy, people's lives. He wants to take it to the level of that nightmarish shit that you have in baseball and MMA and all the rest of it. By the way, sports where people way more affected by performance-enhancing drugs, because there's so far been very few performance-enhancing drugs that actually do advance performance. Except, guess what? Caffeine enhances performance like a motherfucker. They're never going to ban that. Interesting. Moving forwards. Multi-team ownership. Protection against cartels. This is amazing. There's a reason why Riot has strict rules against this in LOL. Also, with these rules, it has driven an enormous surge into investment into challenger teams. We even have one. It's given rise to illegitimate academies. So, okay, protection against cartels. Couldn't this be called a kind of cartel? Couldn't these people, in theory, act in their own interest and set policies, then demand other people do it and eventually boycott things? How is a good cartel protection against cartels? Player rights and treatment. Getting locked into terrible contracts for many years when you are an unsuspecting minor. Not cool. I mean, essentially, you want WESA to protect against people like you, and since like you, other people in WESA. What, really? Now, so you're signing up to, because you need to be policed over your own behaviour, and so do all your friends. Again, don't really understand the logic there. Broadcast rights. Here's an interesting one. This is the biggest revenue driver in real sports. Who knows how this is going to break down in the future, but with a unified voice as a community, we can lobby together to get better deals for the media companies and more. ... By the way, there's no such thing as a 5 dots. You do 3 dots as an ellipsis, and that suggests that like you've cut this comment and that there was more to it and that you've omitted a certain amount. There's no 5 dots, by the way, Sam Matthews. That's you just made that up. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. That's actually one of the end goals of something like this, I would speculate, is one day when all of them together, and they are like an NHL, or they are like a league, and that, yeah, there's NHL sanctioned tournaments, but those are mainly just the NHL and the NHL circuit, then in that world, they get a massive broadcasting deal that they all do as a group, and they get a lot more out of it, and then they split some of the revenue to people within the group, as opposed to just the organizer getting it. But the organizer getting it means that the players then have some say when they can go to different leagues, but they can't go to different leagues now, and the team gets their cut, and the player shuts the fuck up, and he's part of this would-be NHL for esports that's broadcast by one certain person. Yeah, I can see that that's where the big money is, mate. That's why all this razzmatazz and jazz right now about player rights and we've got to help that and make the rules all great, ultimately is all great window dressing, because out back where they're chopping up the meat, that meat's the broadcasting rights for the future to huge leagues, and you being part of a franchise and you being in on the ground floor deciding who gets to be part of that league, how it's run and how the profit sharing goes. That seems to me the real shit that's going on in the back if you look between the lines. Now, interestingly, this sounds like a cartel led by one big org that has some players involved. Now, players have a say, but again, do they make decisions? Also, can this org, cartel, fuck with people who aren't in the cartel? Would seem like it, right? At the very minimum, they could exert pressure on those people by saying, well, we've banded together and you're on your own. Not only that, they can exert pressure on their own players, because if you're a member of a team within the cartel, all the cartel together can exert pressure on you in a way that the team couldn't. That's what he wants. He's trying to make it for good things like, to stop racism. Yeah, how about for other things like to set a standardized pay rate and not allow people to go over a certain amount? And also, how about to make it so that you can only have transfers at certain windows and we're all going to agree to these contracts? And nowadays, you could get poached out of a bad situation. No, you can't though, because that guy's not going to agree to that because he doesn't want his players poached in that certain way. Are all these things as positive as they suggest? They never suggest anything otherwise. One day, players could have leveraged against them the fact that there are WSA only leagues. So now if you want to leave your team, you better join another WSA team and they better agree to that. Your team better agree to it. Otherwise you can't even play in the league you want to play in, which might have all the big broadcasting rights and might have all the money, and therefore you're stuck on the outside. You're playing in the Canadian Football League. Now, there was a post on moneyhouse.ch, so a Swiss site, about like registering this organization or whatever. where one of the lines said, marketing of all the WESA team players, this was translated, remember, from German, players, and the WESA team rights. Now, it's worth pointing out that doesn't necessarily mean exclusive team rights. It might just be under some terms that they've agreed to, but you'd have to imagine fairly exclusive to some degree. Otherwise, what the point of having them be part of this group in this particular sense? Now, James Lampkin, Kennegat, did an interview with Richard Lewis on the Daily Dot. And so I've got a lot of quotes from that I want to bring up because they're interesting. So it said, we felt we had to pull parties together in spite of existing problems or history between the groups. Now, what's interesting there is they still act like they didn't ever want a league or they didn't ever want casters exclusively, that they just want to pull people together and get people to work together, despite the fact they've shown repeatedly throughout their history a tendency towards exclusivity or partial exclusivity at the very least. Whereas, as I said, not only do they want leagues and they want teams to be part of their league only, that repeatedly has happened behind the scenes, but they've even wanted casters and have repeatedly showed that whenever they have the opportunity, if they could, they would sign up the big name casters and have them cast only ESL events. Now, what's funny is, I'm sure that Kennegat himself would be like, well, obviously, if I had a chance to get the best casters for my league only, I would. Yes, I understand that, Kennegat. Therefore, my question is, why would you then think that I'm then going to believe that when you or other people connected with your company, still in controlling positions, are in charge of this, that suddenly you won't act in favour of yourselves and your own self-interest in that particular respect? Because as you've explained, yes, it is obvious to assume that you would. You haven't given any compelling reason as to why you would not, except I want T-Sport to be more professional and standardised. Yeah, brilliant. I mean, for a start off, how about this? Explain this to me, ESL. How is it in your benefit for ESL to be more standardised? If you can explain that and then show me how those benefits also pass on to players, then I'll be interested. Because at the moment, if you were to honestly explain how it would be in your benefit, I would put it forwards, postulate, that those benefits wouldn't help players necessarily, but they would help you in the short and the long term. So here's another one. We need something that's predictable, accessible, and legally sound in order to exit the Wild West era. So that's what we work towards. And let me guess, who's going to be the sheriff of this Wild West? And who will be the landowner of this Wild West? Good thing about a Wild West is a lot of freedom there, a lot of opportunity for different people. No hierarchical support structures in the way that you have to get past to be able to do basic things like own land, like have a business, like do things in a certain way. It's great if you own the town, right? And then suddenly it's not the Wild West and it's just a town at that point in time. Here's another quote. An actual legal structure that would integrate players as stakeholders and to come up with policies and principles that could outlast the popular life cycle of an esport. Here's a problem I have. So does that mean that once these players do this, they're like planting the seeds of a tree that will grow and their children will live under the shade of the tree, but they will never be there themselves because they've gone? Is that what he's implying? Or is he implying that these players in any way get to be stakeholders going forwards? Like, how would a CSGO player be able to operate within his game and make policies? How would that affect a new game that he doesn't play? Or would he get any say in the future game? Or if the game is added, does he get any say? Or if he stops playing and isn't a part of it anymore, is he just kicked out of the squad and now all the rev share goes on? How does this work in this particular sense? Presumably it does, because his contract only lasts a certain amount of time, right? As a result, how would this work with multiple games? What you see today in WESA is the result of dozens of discussions and meetings between teams, organisers, broadcast platforms and players about how to move forwards into the next stage of our industry. And yet, not a single org in these dozens of discussions and meetings with not only teams, but organisers and broadcast partners, not a single other org or broadcast platform got involved after dozens of meetings. So they couldn't sell them after dozens of meetings. There was a sense of responsibility felt to attempt to shatter the paradigm that players, teams, and a league should have oppositional relationships. I mean, that's just like some classic ESL right there. I mean, what, you couldn't shatter that paradigm yourself? You couldn't get them to believe you either, the teams and players who are now joining this organization. You couldn't get them to believe you just as ESL. You had to make this secondary organization to get them to ever believe you could be fair. Well, it's okay. I know I'm full of shit and I sometimes behave in a way that, you know, obviously is in my favour and not your favour, but it's okay. I'll make like a police force that'll police all of us and be fair, and that way I can't do that. Okay, who's going to be on the police force? Well, I'm obviously going to make up like 40% of it, and then in theory, I'm also going to hire the person who's the deciding vote, but you'll get a say and you'll have 40% representation. That seems fair, right? Then he says this. So there is some Game of Thrones style reality to our industry that you and I and others regularly joke about. By the way, what's funny is you guys joke about it. Yeah, as you say, it does exist. The way you joke is like, haha, yeah, I guess everyone's just screwing everyone. Well, no, actually, you're right. You and other people do seem to be screwing people. And even if other people screw people, doesn't mean it's right for you then to then screw people. And that is funny as a joke in a cynical way, like gallows humor, like, we're all going to die when we go over the trenches tomorrow onto the front lines, guys, in World War One, because we're like 2 months in. It's not that funny, though, when you hear people outside getting screwed and you don't have any say in it, right? Funny when you're the one doing the screwing. There exists a power dynamic between press, community, leagues, pundits, players and teams, and often if a party doesn't like a decision of another, the main course of action is to leak it or spin it. And it's pretty successful, right? It forces the initial party to have to react and defend itself, and you are never going to convince an overwhelming majority of your fans of your defense, especially when all of the support behind your defense is NDA'd, with histories that haven't been told, etc. It forces the responses to be bland, corporate, and tough to communicate ideas succinctly. By the way, that last sentence summarizes this WESA announcement and all official statements. So we're going to use that tagline for it, okay? Bland, corporate, and tough to communicate ideas succinctly. Yeah, that's what all these comments have been. Also, by the way, an interesting implication of that, I mean, he hasn't entirely discluded ESL from this, but he's counted as this a problem, is for him to say that statement that this is a big problem and a power dynamic that exists and it's really unfair when like you can't give your support because you're NDA'd, the implication almost is that ESL employees don't leak stuff like that and stuff that they are themselves NDA'd for. And if that's actually any sort of implication that was ever intended behind this, nice joke, mate. Ha ha, pull the other one, it has bells on it. Like, not even vaguely plausible. ESL do that and have done that and will continue to do that. And even when WESA exists, will do that. Now, interestingly, I don't think they'll be leaking a whole lot about WESA. But again, remember, they're independent and that they don't run it and have different self-interests as orgs, remember. It'll just be convenient that they don't. If you look at Dota, you already see plenty of teams turning down events and leagues, and that has started in CS as teams and players began to prioritise more. Pause. If that's true, then why is this needed? Why can't teams already start to do that in CS? In Dota, they don't have WESA. Back to the quote. I think that will continue in the future as the challenges our industry faces become more complicated. With WESA, there will just be more structure and alignment to the process. Now, this notion that there might be too many tournaments and that you need someone to have like a structure and align the way the industry is, and people have to be given like a process by which they could choose which tournaments to enter and don't. Let me just put this out there. ESL run online leagues for the top teams that take up hundreds of days a year for online play and then have a bunch of LANs. So even if every other team in the world stopped existing, ESL themselves are oversaturating the market. Yet, is it any wonder why they then complain about oversaturation? Because guess what? There's not enough space for 5 ESLs in the industry to do that. So it's almost like, let's just have one ESL, shall we? Okay, what would this ESL be called? I nominate ESL. Great. So, the executive committee, there are 5 members, 2 from ESL, 2 team owners, and a commissioner. It was negotiated that way so that in the event of a decision we could not agree on, the commissioner would break the tie. Now, one of the problems I see with that, by the way, is it's presented in that particular way. Like, it's not 5 people, and then they do a vote, and as long as there's at least 3 votes, that it's done that way. He almost makes it sound like the 2 team owners do something, and then the 2 ESL people decide on something, and if it so happens, as occasionally will happen, it's a 2-2 split, then in comes wise King Solomon Pietro, and somehow he's the one person in this entire hierarchical organisation qualified to decide between the 2 positions, and therefore, if the players give their opinion at the meeting, and then the team owners decide their combined position, and ESL decide their combined position, and they come together and they put together 2 possible solutions or 2 possible perspectives. Essentially, even though everyone's involved in the decision-making process, one man decides the whole thing. He has ultimate power. He decides in the end what occurs in that sense. Now, he might decide what the options are, but he's the decider. He's the one who makes that final decision in the end. He can break the tie. Now, that's quite interesting because it's not really necessarily the rest of the organisation described as though it was like that. It's made to sound a lot more flat and structured, yet it is a pyramid. And at the end, there's one person, in a sense, at the top of the pyramid, even though not entirely. He's not like a pure dictator who can do whatever he wants. We intentionally looked outside of our space for this type of person who would have a wealth of experience in sports infrastructure and without the types of esports relationships that could accept the process. What's great there is, in a way, he's just admitted that you can't have someone from esports do this because esports people in their own way will be too political, act in their own self-interest and in the interest of esports relationship they already have set up. And yet, 2 ESL people and 2 team owners are getting to have a massive say in it and put forward the positions that this guy can just choose between. So it's like, choose the lesser of the evils, wise King Solomon. Great. And also, since he's the commissioner and they hired him, Someone from ESL hired this guy and selected him. Essentially, if he just sides with the ESL people, then they can always overrule what the team owners want. Therefore, the fix is in, right? Policies, rule sets, etc. are put forward to that committee from the members and players' committees, and there are both an arbitration court and external auditors to ensure this process is clean at all levels. How? Who are they? What is the arbitration court? All you're doing right now is shifting who makes the decision, who gets to say that it's reasonable, who gets to say that it's fair. The more you shift it and then don't tell us where you're shifting it, we don't even know what's going on over there. We don't know who that is. And if that's someone we don't know, maybe that's actually worse than the players deciding for themselves, the teams deciding for themselves. You haven't given any reason to just why that will make it clean. Like, it's only going to be clean if the people hired are clean, and if their motives are clean, and if they have a self-interest to be clean. Why, at the moment, if they're hired by you and people like you, how can they be clean naturally? How would they automatically be? Why would they ever act against your self-interest? Is that reasonable to suggest? Next one. The same thing applies to issues like match fixing, schedules, participation in events, etc. It doesn't intuitively make sense that WESA would dictate which events players should participate in unless they had a voice at the table in deciding that. Doesn't at all, does it, my friend? Problem is, they have a voice, but are they deciding that? That's the question. They have a voice at the table deciding that. Players aren't deciding it, though. Does that make sense? That's how I would put the question back to you. Does it make sense that they don't have a decision in it? They must be part of setting the standard on which events or conditions WESA teams would expect, or conditions, because ultimately they are the ones playing in it. I agree, but ultimately all they do is get to say their voice, as far as I can tell, right? WESA itself is absolutely open to governing other leagues if the opportunity arose in the same way it will govern ESL Pro League. Except they've already said other orgs couldn't be involved and didn't get a chance to put forward their people. So essentially, ESL is willing to take over your org and how it will run and how it will be governed. But you won't be a part of it, and you won't be an owner, and you won't be a head person, and you won't be a membership person. Well, why the fuck would you let them do that, eh? Great. We, as organisers, tried and were not successful at making it work with more than one organiser at the table. Well, who could imagine why that would be? Even though supposedly you put up a structure that isn't one organiser having a lot of input, and it's going to be fair, and there's going to be arbitration, and there's going to be this Pietro guy who's going to know how to deal with things from the real world, and he'll be able to sort things out, and everyone will have a say, and yet none of these people you could get on board. It's weird that. They're not me, remember? I'm not the ones over there. They don't hate ESL from the past and things that have happened in the past. Why are they biased against you? Why don't they like ESL? It became a case of too many cooks in the kitchen and an inability amongst the organisers to align and to really make things happen. And it was established that we would be building something ineffective. To be clear, these were direct negotiations between organisers without the teams involved. Because, I mean, why would you let the players have a say, right? Have the teams go first and then just their players come along because they're like the chattel, the baggage that they own, and then let them have a say as like a token thing, and then the teams in the org just decide it all, right? I think that organisers realised a fundamental problem in having more than one league or organiser at the table to determine and balance things like schedules when they have direct business impacts on the organiser but not on the teams. So why would teams be in favour of only ESL being the organiser involved in this? Because then surely ESL, in some, even the most inadvertent sense, could prioritise their schedules. Back to this. We are talking about situations like cancelling an event because of schedule conflict type situations. Let's see. So we think the right solution is to have ESL work with other organisers via WESA to balance schedules, but the fundamental structure of WESA doesn't allow for more organisers to be members, even though they've said it's open and inclusive. It does allow for WESA to negotiate, and we think that that will allow for a better relationship because you have players and teams counterbalancing the ESL side. Now, why would they need to be counterbalancing it? Well, I thought everyone was going to work together on shared things. Why would they be balancing the effect of ESL? Especially since ESL themselves shouldn't have much of an implication for this, because this org, in fact, it shouldn't be players versus ESL at all. This org represents players in some very low sense in teams, and then we'll sort of sanction ESL, and therefore ESL will have to come under their standards. Oh, but ESL's part of it as well and has some say in it. Interesting how complicated it gets, eh? We think it will allow for a better relationship because you have players and teams counterbalancing the ESL side, and they are typically in favour of participation in other events and leagues. Okay, so in that case, how will those leagues be able to work alongside WESA and WESA teams? I mean, this suggests surely they can't, because they tried to get them involved to work alongside them before, couldn't come to any solution, said it was ineffective, and yet now it's going to be effective and now it's going to work without just telling those teams this is how it's going to be and that's how it's going to be effective, mate, because I've got the gun and you're on the other side of it. I got the gun, I got the shotgun, you got the briefcase. That's the rules. Surely that suggests that they can't, because no solution was found. Also, what is the future for this association if all those other orgs and broadcasters can't be a part of WESA? Other organisers can't be a part of it. So no matter how big this gets or how big they get, they can never be a part of it. All they can do is allow ESA to sanction them. Now, from the AMA, there was a lot of interesting shit. So here's some good stuff. There's a lot of similarities between founding of WESA and founding of, for example, NHL. The National Hockey League started in 1917 with just 6 teams and has grown to what it is today, a massive league with teams on multiple levels in several divisions. Now, what's interesting is why reference the part about it being a massive league with multiple teams in several divisions? Because problem is, first of all, we aren't starting at step one. We aren't starting a league and we aren't starting with these teams, and it's not like there's nothing established and that's how we're going to build to almost think. We've already got a lot of the things, and a lot of what this is going to do is going to mirror and be slightly different, but in the same vein as things that have existed before. So we're not in that scenario. Also, why haven't you explained what the benefits of the NHL was in the way they created it that we didn't already have in hockey before the NHL? And as a result, how WESA likewise would take something we don't have in esports and provide it now. Because at the moment, that what you've described that's good is that the NHL grew and now it's a massive league with teams on multiple levels and divisions. So essentially, if this was a cartel, you're saying, well, the good thing about the cartel is, as it goes on, the cartel's going to get bigger and have more members and going to be able to run more things in the cartel. Well, yeah, but why is that good to have a cartel then? Why is that good for everyone else as well? How's that positive if someone thinks a cartel's negative? You haven't actually outlined the analogy even very well there. Then Ralph comes in and he says, oh, that was Ralph who said that actually. So then in comes, oh no, here comes Ralph. It is not an exclusive league. The NHL example is there because they started small and then became bigger. WESA is more comparable to an association like UEFA in that sense. Seems like you picked the wrong analogy then in that particular sense, right? I mean, if you just wanted to use an analogy, as he's suggesting, for something that started small and then became bigger, don't know, Ralph, an acorn maybe? Ever seen those, mate? They're like about this big, tiny little like seed. You put it down and then it grows into like a fucking massive tree. That's a pretty good example, right? I wouldn't pick a league which is an exclusive league with franchises that is run overall and has like a domineering rev share and essentially has like sort of a cartel-like grip on hockey itself in terms of the biggest league and runs everything with an iron fist. If you want to totally separate yourself from the notion that this is like an ESL, an exclusive league, and ever will be an exclusive league, and ever will be run by one person. So I'd probably steer away from that, mate. Also, what was the point of the NHL example in that scenario? As far as I can tell, nothing to do with the NHL has yet been pointed out to be a merit, aside from the fact it grew. Okay. Here's another one. That is the executive board, talking about those 4 members in the committee, but the majority of decisions are made by the members meeting with a 75% majority. Now, again, I don't know what that means. It's not explained. What 75% majority what? And what do you mean what decisions are made? The majority decisions, the meaningful decisions, small decisions, we don't know. Likewise, what decisions are made only by the executive board? These would be interesting things to know. Now, again, not a single example given. And we're not asking for NDA shit. We're just asking for a basic example of the type of thing that we're not given any information on that. And by the way, if we're not given any information now, why would they ever give us any information? We're not part of WESA. We're just a bunch of fucking plebs who watch the game, right? So we're never going to get that information. Here's another one. There's a list of requirements for joining WESA, which includes, but is not limited to, the organisations carrying multiple games, having a long history in developing and fostering AAA esports talent, having experience with and a commitment to growing esports through their organisation. Not every team meets these requirements right now, but the board of WESA is and will remain proactive in searching for teams to join in and is in active talks with several additional teams already. Interesting how they've already switched away from player rights on that one, and this is just like players say as well. This is all just about what the team is like as to whether you can join. Even though if it was really about player rights, they'd be a lot more inclusive of teams, right? Because it's about getting the players the right situation. At the moment, it's all about what your org's like as to whether you're going to be part of it, which determines if you ever get a say as a player in any particular way, or to even say your opinion. There's a big difference between having a say and getting to say your opinion. Elsewhere, they mention that they are non-profit, right? First of all, I'm not an expert on law, so I don't know this, but people have suggested that the registration of the company doesn't match being a non-profit. So here's a question for you. If you're a non-profit and it's just set up by ESL, but it's independent, does the money come from ESL? Where does the money come from? Also, did you pay people to join this league? That's not mentioned anywhere by them or ever referenced. Yet if it happened, it'd be very interesting, right? Now, they also point out as a big deal, arbitration. The idea that like there'll be a separate body that can decide when there's a conflict of interest and what's going on and whatnot, and decide the way something should be done and what's fair for who in this particular deal of player transfer or whatever. Now, Esports Law EU, who interestingly is a lawyer who, as far as I know, I think actually might have worked with ESL and might even still work with ESL, comes in and says, how do you deal with the fact that in some countries, arbitration is not allowed in employment contracts as dispute settlement? Now, here's what's interesting about that, is that they never replied to her either. Again, hours and hours ago. So when it comes to arbitration, my questions would be, by who? Again, we've got no indication of that. How do we know they're independent? Do we ever get to find out who they are? No indication given right now. Now, here's another part. Oh, this is actually also from her statement, I think. It said, to give some context, some countries would qualify players as employees, depending on the structure and relationship between players and organizations. How will you tackle the challenge that under certain circumstances, if you go for full compliance, these players could not participate in arbitration? No information given. Now, okay, let's address some other things. And some of this is going to be speculation and things I've heard. And we're just going to go for it. So first and foremost, were people paid to join? Now, Sir Scoot said that people were paid $150,000 each to join. Hence why, when I heard that privately, not from Scoots, I actually said how short-sighted I thought it was some of these teams to join, except the ones that are in absolute financial debt, which I sort of vaguely understand. Then the guy who's the Fnatic CEO comes out and says, first of all, Fnatic is part of this initiative for the framework it sets for involved parties. The revenue share principle is a part of that. So joining member teams and players benefit from that principle too. A part of that is a guarantee from WESA. Now here's the problem with that. Is the guarantee for what revenue share you will get? Or is the guarantee you get some money up front to go along with your revenue share and all the rest of it? He doesn't really address the revenue share, the upfront money, if indeed you got a signing bonus from the AMA. Likewise, if you get paid, why did you need to be paid to join this organization? Secondly, there was possible team exclusivity. There is an implication of possible team exclusivity in a few years with these teams. Of the circumstances that eventually, if you stay within the organization, maybe you will one day be owned by the organization, which is not the same as being owned by ESL, but as people are finding out, it's kind of hard to fully tell the difference between them and how ESL does or doesn't exert control over this org. If one day you have exclusivity of teams to this organization and then they only play at that point in WESA sanctioned tournaments, now you essentially have an exclusive league, and now you have one league in a way controlling an exclusive league with, yes, a lot of levels of abstraction between it, but ultimately a similar sort of goal accomplished. And in line with this, Colin Deschong, alias Lecter, who is the COO of Good Game Agency and was formerly a co-owner of Evil Geniuses, who were one of the biggest orgs from like 2010, 2012 or so. He says, WESA's endgame is to prioritize ESL events. Whether it happens now or in 3 years, that is where it heads. And I kind of see that. Like, that's kind of the general trend I get from this. It's that the exclusivity thing didn't work out in the past. People shouted it down. There was backlash. People fought against them successfully in the industry. So the plan now is this is like okay, we had to take a step back, so now we take a tiny step forwards again. If we have to take a little step back, then we take a tiny step forwards again. As long as we're step by step tiptoeing our way towards where we want to get, we get there in the end by whatever means necessary. So, exclusive league to me is the obvious next step for this sort of a thing. Or at worst, making other leagues become subjugate to ESL circuit, although it would be the WESA circuit, but ESL seem to be quite similar in that sense, and would there be a difference? Therefore, in a way, it's sort of like the ESL circuit, but now ESL themselves have just become part of WESA, even though some ESL people are involved in that and still are involved in ESL. Interesting. There is no set revenue sharing in the model as far as we're aware. That's what I've heard. I've heard that it's not even a set percentage for each team. It's not necessarily the same percentage for each team. Not only that, they're not even, I speculate, required to tell teams what they make from a deal. They can go to a team and go, right, we've given you this much from this deal we got from this company, but you don't know the total of what they made and what everyone else's revenue share is. Also, when you see all the protracted discussions going backwards and forwards, and now these teams joining now, I think you now are starting to get a sense for why there were massive delays on E-League in announcing all their teams, right? There was exclusivity talks going on. There were people trying to get people into certain leagues and out of other leagues and getting certain leagues to overlap and not schedule with other ones. And this is why E-League took so long. Now, there are tons and tons of vague comments in this AMA. Here's a great one. The transparency starts today with the announcement. At which point then someone points out that in the LA Times, when asked to provide copies of its bylaws and other founding documents, WESA declined to immediately provide copies. Well, there goes the transparency. So starting today. Starting now. Could I have a look at those bylaws? Starting now. No, and starting now. Like, what's going on here, guys? So, also, they seem in this AMA to always ignore any questions about conflict of interest. They just spin it a different way. And yet they claim to have the answers. They claim to be misrepresented. This is unfair, the way you're treating us as a just DSL here. And yet they never can reasonably address the conflict of interest. They're constantly pushing that player angle. They want the whole emphasis to be on the player angle because obviously they know most of us support the players and think the players are getting a raw deal. Yet the players have input, but not real decision-making power. Players have no power. They're represented, but without power, not even voting power necessarily on some things. And they say the majority, but we don't know what the majority are. Will players have ham or cheese sandwiches at future sanctioned events? I think we're going to go with ham. Most people said ham. Okay, we're going to go with ham. Will it be Coke or Sprite? I guess we're going to go with Sprite. This one, Sprite. Okay, there's 2 out of the 3 things we're going to decide. You players have decided the majority. Now, the third thing is, will players have a set maximum salary? And this will now be decided by the executive committee. Goodbye. Yeah, technically you kept your word right. The majority was decided by the others. I need to know what types of decisions, though. So they were constantly pushing all that angle, and yet we see ESL and the org heads are the ones with the real power, and they're exactly the people, they're the only people in esports who have held players down, kept players down, and tried to fuck with players over the years. I mean, when I mean ESL, I mean all tournament organizers, not specifically just ESL, the only ones. People are worried that they're going to make an exclusive league, right? So just as a joke, let's imagine this conversation. People, they're really worried that we're going to make an exclusive league again. Didn't we try to make an exclusive league? No, that's a lie. I don't know who told you that. And it wasn't me. That was my evil twin. But tell you what, how would we, if we were, like OG Simpson, what if we were to make an exclusive league? How would we do it if people won't let us make one and call it an exclusive league? Just don't call it an exclusive league. Well, how would that work, though? How about calling it the opposite of it? In fact, it's not an exclusive league. It's an inclusive association of teams who happen to be the people who play in leagues, and the leagues will have to meet the standards of this association. Therefore, it's like teams playing in a league, but with abstraction to it. Yeah, true, it's true. So then what would we do with the teams who don't join us or who fight against us? Just change the standards so that they can't be part of it, and then essentially just the teams that meet the standards are in it? That sounds kind of exclusive. See what I'm saying? Now, here's what's funny, okay? The reason I do that joke there is because I actually want now to address people from ESL who are in charge of this and who are watching this video. Hello. So here's my questions for you. You have a conspiracy theory about esports, okay? And the conspiracy theory you have goes like this. People are biased against us in esports. For some reason, they don't want our help. For some reason, they paint us really unfairly and twist everything we say and make it black and white that we're evil and they're good. And they just see deceit and connivance in all of our actions. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? And you know what? What do you imagine makes people incapable of understanding that you are here to help them? What do you think it is that holds them back from that? Why do you think nobody from the other companies, even in private, is supporting this initiative, this concept, thinking, well, I'm not involved in it, but it is a good idea, and I wish them well, I think it's going to go well. Why do you think people from other games that aren't CSGO are like, what the fuck is this? And I don't ever want to be part of that. And even laughing, this is ridiculous. This is even making fun, like, this is so obviously ESL's involved and they're controlling it, and I can see where they're headed down the future, that they probably want to have some sort of exclusivity on some degree. Why do you think people are doing that? People aren't me, by the way. I'm not any of these people right now. Why is everyone else doing that? We can understand why I might not like the way you do things. I have a different philosophy on many different aspects, and you fucked with me. So I give a little back, don't I? A little dig back. Trademark move. But why do these other people who aren't necessarily against you, some of them who even maybe like you, some of them even work with you at certain events and other games, Why are these people so against you? Or why do they not understand the vision? Why have you been unable, even in private, where you're not necessarily NDA'd to the same degree and you can get away with saying these things, why have you never been able to convince these people? These are real questions to ask yourselves. These aren't rhetorical questions. I know they sound like rhetorical questions to make the point that, like, it's obviously a ridiculous conspiracy theory, but I would really ask yourself these questions and ask yourself why you just can't get through to people in this particular sense. Now, what's interesting is, before I end this video, I just want to give a certain point, which is when I said that the reason Chinese and Korean teams haven't joined is they've already got their own WESA. They've got Ace and Kesper. And by the way, Ace and Kesper don't share power with anyone. They run their scenes and they own their scenes, basically. And there is no set aspect. They may as well have exclusive leagues in as much as they decide the leagues that people play in. In Kesper, Korean Esports Association, teams either join Kesper or they don't, but you have to try and play in a Kesper league regardless. They run the big leagues. Some of the people in Kesper are heads of the most powerful orgs in Kesper and in their history. And some of them have even, like this scenario, gotten to be the head of the org. And so what, will they never be biased against their own org? No, we're supposed to believe they don't always act in the interest of their own org, even when they're simultaneously running their own org. Likewise, they basically run esports in their regions. Hence, by the way, where they would fuck up WSA if they ever tried to encroach on their ground. In Kesper, you have to have a pro gamer license to play in Kesper things. So they can even control who you are as a player there and what you do. Likewise, once you've got the license, they can maybe even control what tournaments you go to beyond that, as we saw in StarCraft 2, where Kesper didn't allow players to go to certain tournaments, etc. Organizations who want to run tournaments in Korea have to have a Kesper license to run the tournament, or have to license it. Not only that, usually as part of it, you can't just run it yourself. You can't come into Korea and just run your own event. You have to get a regional partner and work with them, which is probably someone sanctioned by Kesper, and might even be, in some sense, Kesper themselves. And you have to work with them, pay them money, and they'll provide some of the staff, even though you're totally capable, maybe even better than Kesper, in order to run events at all. You don't have a say in it otherwise. This looks like the behavior of a cartel to a degree, right? Now, what's interesting is in Korea, this is all accepted and no one ever thinks differently, because the paradigm in Korea of business is like this. They have something called a chaebol, and a chaebol is like a sort of company, but ultimately most of them are like dynastic families. And these companies own lots of smaller companies. And what happens is when you go to the top of the Korean system, it's like hundreds of companies and hundreds of small things that seem totally separate, and some that are even competitors, are owned by the same 4 to 5 mega corporations. And those are essentially certain families. And some of the corporations, the chaebols, are even related to each other very closely or indirectly, and therefore it's almost like this whole power structure that goes down. And so what's funny is that's just the way their societies run. So obviously their esports run that way. And as a result, they essentially are monopolies and mini monopolies and monopolies that build into other monopolies and that cooperate with other monopolies. And it's all working that particular way. And yet, when we apply this to the Western model, obviously people would spaz out if they heard, oh my God, what monopolies? Oh my God, no, we can't have any of that. Stuff like that would be, as in the West, is broken up by big governments. Although you could argue they just use a level of abstraction to do some of that shit as well, like ESL's trying to do on this particular sense. I just thought I'd give that example because it's not like these things have never happened in esports before. And yeah, some good things came out of Kesper in terms of some standardization thing. Some nightmare things came out as well, like forcing players to play 12 hours a day and making nightmare they actually made transfers worse for players in Brood War, where you had to do something mad. Like if you were the new team signing, you had to pay double the guy's salary, give like one half of it to the team, and then like pay another thing to the, like, it was so complicated. It made it so essentially once a player was in a team, they had like a stranglehold over the rest of his career, because it's very unlikely someone else would buy him out in that sense. So in summary, WESA Association, lots of questions, barely any answers given to us. No matter how much they talk, we don't seem to get any extra information. There's a lot of signal noise in what they're saying. Their version of answers just seem like even more complicated, vague statements which try to cover a lot of areas without ever actually attaching themselves to an area or promising anything or giving any concrete details or examples, and therefore they're free to pull back from that later and say, well, we never actually meant that. You just misinterpreted it that way. Well, don't let me misinterpret. Be quite specific. Let me ask my specific question, answer my specific question. I do want to say, by the way, I don't think ESL is like some entirely evil or malicious company in that particular sense. I just think that if we're being real, they're just painfully obsessed with their own self-interest, and not just their own survival, but thriving, and at times thriving, sometimes at the cost of others, if they think that they do things the right way. And as a result, in a sense, yes, they want esports to grow, only the part of esports they're involved in and their vision of esports. And any other part, I actually think they're willing to act in the detriment of what might be the collective of esports as it stands right now. It also just as an aside point, we probably won't like this, but it reminds me of certain ways that you hear, like, in the conspiracies of the Illuminati. This is a very famous conspiracy theory, right? One of the ways that people who try to present it as something positive, not just some evil corporation running the whole world or group of people or whatever, they try to present it as, right, well, there's this group of people who are really smart and they have their own vision for the world and they think it's going to be better, like they're the good guys. And the problem is, though, they realize like people are just too profane and people are just heathens and they just won't listen and they have to be controlled. So for their own good, these guys have to like implement control over them, and in doing so, they will lead the world towards illumination and save people from themselves. It feels sometimes like ESL are on that sort of a vibe or a tip or frequency, which is that's where it gets dangerous for me, because they don't have to do that. They don't have to do that to be successful like they are in the leagues right now. It's just unnecessary. And so I think they've done a very poor job of explaining this. And yeah, in some ways they've like put out some of the fires of this being an exclusive league, but the implications of what's going on is what's worrying, and they haven't done a good job at all of addressing those. So it's not the end of the world right now. It's just there are a lot of potential issues in the future, and so far they've done a really bad job of articulating what benefits are actually going to be brought to the scene, and it really remains to be seen what benefits there will be to this.